Thanks, Kathy. As Kathy mentioned, I work for the Center for Watershed Protection. For those of you that aren't familiar with the center, we're a nonprofit located in Ellicott City, Maryland, with a few satellite offices on the East Coast. Our mission is to protect, restore, and enhance our waterways, and we do this through applied research, technical assistance on watershed and stormwater management, and training for local government agencies, watershed organizations, consultants, and other groups across the country. So the outline for today's webcast is we're going to talk about a project that was funded by the Forest Service about crediting trees for stormwater management. So I'm going to give kind of an overview of that project, present some of the research that we found, and how others are crediting trees for stormwater, as well as present the new crediting framework that was developed through the project. And then turn it over to Justin, who's going to go into some detail on a water balance model that provided the basis for this credit. And then we'll kick it back over to me to give a case study example of how this credit has been adopted by the Chesapeake Bay program. So most of you are probably familiar with stormwater BMPs. There are many different kinds, as you can see from this picture, but most of them are they're designed to capture and remove pollutants from runoff from a defined drainage area. So engineers designing these BMPs follow a set of specifications that include credit calculations, which are typically based on monitoring studies of these practices. So monitoring studies of pollutant removal performance. And the credits are typically designed to be simple calculations that work well with the with existing and accepted engineering methods and models. So the urban tree canopy is increasingly being considered also as a stormwater BMP for compliance with stormwater management requirements for new development and redevelopment, compliance with TMDLs, for reducing combined sewer overflows, or even for getting a reduction in your stormwater utility fee. However, the difficulty or the challenges with developing credits for urban tree canopy that provide that same type of information as for structural stormwater BMPs, it's a challenge to do this for many reasons. First, urban trees that are just planted that don't have, that aren't associated with a structural BMP, they don't have a defined drainage area. So they're just capturing rainfall that falls on the canopy. So it's difficult to quantify those benefits because there's not a defined inflow and outflow point like there would be with a structural stormwater BMP. Another difference is that unlike structural practices, which typically provide the maximum benefit right after they're built and then decrease over time, trees are the opposite in that when you first plant them, they're pretty small, but as they grow, the benefits increase. So it makes it a challenge to deal with them in the same way as with other stormwater BMPs. Some other concerns are that when you plant trees in urban areas, the conditions there can be very harsh. The picture that you see here shows what is pretty typical in many urban areas where there's a very small planting pit, so there's a small amount of soil that's available to the tree. The soil quality may not be very good. You're dealing with high temperatures that trees are exposed to, and they're also often receiving runoff that contains salt and other pollutants. So there's some skepticism about whether or not trees planted in the urban environment can actually survive and thrive in order to be able to provide water quality benefits. There's also questions about maintenance, whether they're actually going to be watered and maintained over time. So for all these reasons, there's often a lack of incentive for people to really use trees extensively for stormwater management requirements. So what we're going to talk about today is a project that was designed to address these challenges. It's called Making Urban Trees Count. And this is a project that was funded by the Forest Service through a National Urban and Community Forestry Advisory Council grant. We started it about 3 years ago with the goal of providing a crediting framework, a national crediting framework for urban trees to meet stormwater management requirements that was based on the science. And the major project components included a literature review, a review of existing systems for crediting trees, what others are doing across the country, And then credit development, which was done through an expert panel and development of the water balance model that Justin will talk about later today. And then there was also a pilot study component where we tested out parts of the draft credits in a local community. So the literature review was designed to address these two questions listed here, namely, what is the effectiveness of urban tree canopy on reducing runoff, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment loads? And then the second question was more about, well, what variables, what factors affect the effectiveness of urban tree canopy? And really what we found is that there were very few studies that directly addressed the water quality benefits of urban trees. Most of the studies focused more on the hydrologic aspects. And so we expanded the review to include non-urban trees as well as to include urban forests, although we considered the results of those studies to be sort of an upper limit of the type of credit that an urban tree could provide. We ended up reviewing 159 studies, and the literature review is available for download at the link shown here. But we found, as I mentioned, most of the studies focused on the hydrologic cycle, and most of those studies really just focused on one component of the hydrologic cycle. So that was the first step. The graphic here illustrates all of those different processes involved and the complexity and difficulty of designing a single monitoring study that would capture all those elements and actually be able to quantify those benefits. But what you can see here is kind of the general processes and mechanisms by which trees reduce runoff and pollutant loads. And those processes are pretty well known, pretty well accepted, but the difficult part is actually quantifying those benefits because there are so many different variables that affect those processes. So we've got rainfall interception, evapotranspiration, infiltration, uptake of pollutants from soil and groundwater. As I mentioned, most studies only focused on one aspect, and few of them directly measured water quality. The other thing that we found is that the studies were pretty variable in the scales that they looked at and the methods that they used. So some of them may have only measured or monitored, say, rainfall interception, and maybe they did it over an annual time scale, whereas other studies looked at an individual storm event or a particular season, or they just looked at one individual tree species. And so those results weren't necessarily comparable to each other to be able to put them together in a meaningful way. This is just an example of that variability that I mentioned. This is for one factor alone. This is rainfall interception. So the amount of trees or the amount of rainfall that an individual tree or the tree canopy can intercept is affected by so many different things, including the storm event characteristics, such as rainfall intensity, duration, and frequency. It's also influenced by the tree characteristics, so things like leaf area, the characteristics of the leaf surface, whether the tree is evergreen versus deciduous. Also, the season or the time of year is important, and meteorological factors. And so when you account for this great amount of variability for each of these factors, you can see why it's difficult for anyone to, to design a study that that easily, just gives you that one number that people are really looking for in a credit. So the second thing that we did was we looked at how other states and cities across the country are accrediting trees for stormwater management. And what we found were there was 4 kind of common variables. The first is that most of the credits that we found were credits for meeting stormwater management requirements on site. So this is management requirements for new development and redevelopment projects. A much smaller number of credits were for TMDLs. The second variable is the type of practice, and there were really 4 different things that we saw here. Some of the crediting programs credited conservation of existing individual trees on a site. Some of them gave credits for forest conservation, and then the other 2 options were planting new trees or doing new reforestation projects. So the credits were a little bit different depending on which type of BMP you're applying. All of the credits distinguished between the tree types, so the credits are typically higher for an evergreen tree versus deciduous tree, just because it's got it has leaves all year long and can provide more benefit year-round. And then the last variable is the metric, which is really the currency of what the credit is. So for some crediting systems, the requirement is to reduce runoff or pollutant loads, and the credit goes along with that currency. One of the more common ones, though, is impervious cover-based metric, and this is where this is typically used for meeting stormwater management requirements, where so the stormwater designer has to calculate the treatment volume required for that site. But the way the credits would typically work for impervious cover reduction is that for every tree you plant, you might get a credit for reducing a certain amount of impervious cover on the site. So basically, you get to subtract a certain amount of impervious cover out of your existing site impervious cover, which reduces the amount of, or the volume of water that you have to treat with structural practices. And so it's kind of an indirect incentive to plant more trees on the site, because you're going to have to spend less money to construct those structural practices. And then all of the crediting systems included some qualifying conditions. So typically those were things like picking from an approved species list, planting the tree within a certain distance of impervious cover, or soil volume or soil amendment requirements. And then this table just gives an example for one type of credit. So this is a comparison of credits across different states and cities for planting one individual deciduous tree, just to kind of show you the range of things that we found. And the most common one is to use an impervious cover-based credit. You can see there's about 6 cities up at the top here that give a credit for 100 square feet per tree. Some of the others are volume-based, and then 2 of them are pollutant load-based. All of the ones in the table here, except for the Chesapeake Bay program credit, are for meeting stormwater management requirements for new development and redevelopment, and the Chesapeake Bay program credit is for meeting TMDLs. Some other things to point out here is that some of these credits provide extensive documentation, and extensive research was done to develop them. Minnesota is a good example of that. I know there was a study, too, behind the Seattle credit. Vermont's is pretty recent. I think they did some research there to develop that credit. But then there are others where there really isn't a lot of basis or documentation behind the numbers. So it's interesting to see how others are crediting trees. And another thing to point out is that all of the credits here, except for Minnesota and I think Vermont, it's just for planting trees, not in a stormwater practice. It's just trees that are planted alone. But Minnesota, I believe, the credit is for trees that are planted in trenches with filter media. And I think Vermont gives credit for trees planted individually as well as planted in a stormwater practice. But the Chesapeake Bay program credit shown here, this is the one that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail later as a case study. So based on what we found with the literature review and how others are crediting trees, and based on what we know about what stormwater managers and regulatory agencies need in a crediting system, this is kind of a summary here of the challenges and the gaps. So we didn't find a large number of studies that were really able to quantify the water quality benefits of urban trees. And there was a lot of variability, and the individual studies were hard to compare due to the different scales and methods that were used. Another thing that I didn't mention before, but it showed up in the graphic earlier with all the different tree processes, is this issue of leaf litter and how leaf litter actually contributes to nutrient load in urban areas. And so another thing that we found there is that there is research on that, and we know that leaf litter does contribute to nutrient loads, but there isn't enough data to really be able to quantify for an individual tree planted how much is that. So that's another future area of research that we'd like to be able to refine. But the last bullet that you see up here is, given all of those challenges and gaps with the research, we still need to be able to come up with a crediting system that's simple and that works within the current setup of the compliance program and works within existing stormwater models and methods so that people will actually use it. So this was our challenge, And this was kind of the basis for developing a water balance model, which is what Justin's going to cover in his presentation. But before we move on to Justin's, I have one last slide to basically, we developed a water balance model that Justin will go into detail on, but we used the results of that model to develop a new national crediting framework. It's recently been posted on our website. I think we just released it last week. And all the materials are available for download at the link on the bottom of the slide here. And so the credits are, there's two different kinds. There's the pollutant load reduction credit, and this is an annual nutrient and sediment load reduction credit for compliance with TMDLs. And then the second one is a stormwater performance-based credit, and this is for meeting on-site stormwater management requirements for a certain design storm. And so the credit for that one is volume reduction, but it also provides nutrient and sediment reduction as well, because some communities have pollutant load reduction requirements for on-site stormwater management as well. So the materials that are available for each credit include a summary of the credit, how it works, what's required to use it, and then it also includes a spreadsheet calculator that you put in a set of required inputs, a set of optional inputs, and you get an output for whatever tree planting scenario you've put in there. And they're all available for free download, and really the intent of these credits is that, or the audience for these credits is the regulatory agencies. So we wanted to provide a framework where this information could be integrated into TMDL programs, stormwater management programs, so that regulatory agencies had a basis for providing a credit for tree planting. And the pollutant load reduction credit here, the case study that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the webinar is based on this credit. So it was, but both of these came out of the water balance model that Justin is going to cover in a few minutes. And actually, but I think we're going to take a quick break, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy for a few poll questions first. So I'm going to wrap up the webcast with a presentation of a case study of a relatively new credit for urban tree planting that's been adopted by the Chesapeake Bay program. And this credit was based upon a version of the water balance model that Justin just described. So I know a lot of you on the webcast are not from the Chesapeake Bay watershed, so I want to give some background first on the context for this credit, which is the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. And a TMDL stands for total maximum daily load, and it defines the maximum amount of a given pollutant that a water body can receive and still meet its intended uses. So this TMDL is for nutrients and sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. It was established in 2010 by EPA. And in order to be able to meet its intended uses, there are certain reduction requirements by the jurisdictions in the watershed. And you can see the percentage requirements shown here, but these amounts or these reductions need to be achieved by 2025 in order to meet the TMDL goals. This is the largest ever established TMDL. It includes parts of 6 states and the District of Columbia with a 64,000 square mile watershed. So it's, as you can imagine, it's a pretty complex task to try to keep track of all of this. And the basic process is that the jurisdictions, the states involved, they have to submit plans outlining how they're going to achieve these reductions through implementing best management practices. And so the basis for tracking all of this is the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. So that over time, as jurisdictions implement these plans, they can keep track of what BMPs are being implemented and where, and be able to give credit, pollution reduction credit towards those TMDL requirements. So the process that's used by the Chesapeake Bay program for determining how much credit a given BMP is assigned is called an expert panel process. And this is something that they adopted several years ago. And in 2015, they convened an expert panel related to the urban tree canopy BMP. So the goal was to define how much nutrient and sediment reduction could be assigned to tree planting in order to be accounted for in the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. So the panel was composed of 15 experts, including panel support from the Chesapeake Bay program. My colleague Neely Law was the panel chair, and I was a member of the panel, and I think I see some of our panel members online here today. But the charge of the panel was to review the available literature and use that literature and best professional judgment to make recommendations on pollution reduction estimates for urban tree canopy as a BMP. So I already just talked a little bit about what the findings were of the literature review and the need for developing a water balance model. And so the model that Justin described was developed as part of this panel. Justin and his colleague Miriam Divers developed this model, and that's what the recommendations were based on. So the final report you can see on this slide here. There's a link at the bottom. You can download the report that has the recommendations. But the process that the Chesapeake Bay program uses for these expert panels involves not only making these recommendations, but then going through a pretty rigorous review process. So the recommendations have to be approved by several different work groups. And so by the end, I think it was towards the end of 2016, the final approval was given for these recommendations. So EPA has officially adopted this as their approved approach to credit tree planting, as have the states in the Bay watershed. This slide really just gives a little more background and context to how the credit works, because it relies on, it ties into how land uses are represented in the watershed model. So land uses are one of the major sources of pollution represented in the Bay watershed model. And recently, the Chesapeake Bay program obtained some high-resolution imagery to update that model. And so currently, existing tree canopy is represented as its own land use in the model, which is kind of unique. I don't know that other regulatory agencies have that level of detail in their tracking. But what's interesting about it is that the tree canopy land use is distinct from forest land use in the model. So each land use is assigned its own unique pollutant loading rate. So forest has the lowest pollutant loading rate of all the land uses, and tree canopy is kind of in between forest and turf or other urban land uses. So the thought there is that you have forest cover, which is there's usually it's a contiguous forested area. There's some kind of minimum area requirements to classify something as forest, but it also has the forest structure and understory and the soils, and so that type of land use is going to provide more benefit than tree canopy, which basically are all the other areas that are not forest but that have tree canopy on them. So it can include individual trees, groups of trees, patches and forest fragments that aren't large enough to really count as forest, but they still provide more benefit than landscaped area or a grassy area. And so the graphic here kind of just gives an example for total nitrogen of what those loading rates are like relative to each other. So the dark green, which is the forest, has the lowest pollutant loading rate. The medium green there is the urban tree canopy, which is a little bit higher. The lightest green is the turf, which is even higher. And then, of course, the highest one is the nitrogen loading rate from impervious cover. So all this just to illustrate that existing tree canopy is represented as a land use in the model. So the benefits of existing tree canopy are already accounted for. But then as people plant new trees to get credit for a BMP, that credit is given based on the expert panel protocols. So the panel recommendations actually include two different BMP definitions. There's urban tree canopy expansion and urban forest planting. And urban forest planting is, I think it's less commonly used, but if you're planting in an urban area and you're doing a larger scale project with the intent of establishing forest-like conditions, then you would essentially get credit for converting however many acres you're planting from turf grass to forest land use. And so your credit would be the difference in the pollutant loading rates for those two different land cover types. But to qualify for that credit, you have to meet some minimum requirements that are set by your individual state for planting density and management and maintenance and understory and things like that. So the urban tree canopy expansion BMP is basically all the other planting projects that don't meet the definition of urban forest planting and that aren't part of a riparian forest buffer or a structural stormwater BMP, because those types of plantings would be credited through their own separate BMPs, because riparian forest is its own BMP, and then if you're planting in a structural BMP, you would be credited through a different process. So urban tree canopy expansion basically covers all the individual tree plantings, groups of trees, and small-scale plantings. And so this is really the focus of the presentation here, and was the primary focus of the expert panel. But the basis of the credit is essentially what Justin has described with his model, is that trees reduce runoff and pollutant loads relative to loads from turf or impervious cover without the tree canopy there. And the water balance model is what was used to actually quantify that reduction. So the way the credit is applied is that it's a relative reduction of the pollutant load from the land cover that you're planting on. So if you're planting a tree in a grassy area, then you're going to get a % reduction of the pollutant load from turf grass as it's established in the model. If you're planting a street tree or a parking lot tree or something else, another type of situation where the canopy is primarily going to be over impervious cover, then it's considered canopy over impervious. And so then you would get a % reduction of the pollutant load from impervious cover. So the table here are basically the results from Justin's model, and you can see it's just a % reduction that varies based on whether you're planting over turf grass or impervious cover, and the numbers are also slightly different for the 3 different pollutants of interest. So how the credit is actually applied is that if you're at the local level and you're using this BMP to try to meet your TMDL requirements, the things that you need to report are how many trees you're planting, whether you're planting over turf or impervious cover, where you're planting, and that's important because the pollutant loading rates vary depending on where you are in the Bay watershed. And then you also need to note when you're planting the trees. Another thing that I think Justin touched on but wasn't officially part of, it was kind of a separate analysis done by the expert panel, is that because what's being reported is the number of trees planted, but the credit is based on acres of land that's converted from one use to another. We needed to have some way to translate a number of trees planted into acres of tree canopy. And so we used iTree Forecast, which is one of the iTree suite of tools to, and iTree Forecast projects canopy growth over time, given a set of defined inputs. And so we did a series of modeling scenarios to come up with a number. And basically the number you can see here is for each tree that you plant, you would get credit for converting 144 square feet of turf or impervious cover to urban tree canopy, which basically equates to about 300 trees per acre. And this area reflects the tree canopy, or the projected canopy size 10 years after planting. And so you put in that required information, the conversion factor comes in, and so do those % reductions, and then your output of this credit is the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reductions in pounds per year for the tree planting project that you did. A quick note on the 10 years after planting, that was chosen for 2 reasons. One is that, as I mentioned before, when you first plant a tree, it's not really providing its full benefits. It's going to provide its maximum benefit when it's large. So there's this question of, when you give credit, do you want to give the credit for how much it's going to provide 25 years from now, and take the chance that the tree may not live, and then you're giving credit for something that's not actually there. Or if you give very little credit, then you're not providing a true incentive for people to really use tree planting as a BMP. And so the 10 years was kind of a nice middle ground between those 2 extremes, but it also aligned very nicely with the time frame about which a tree that's planted gets large enough to actually get picked up on the high-resolution imagery and then mapped as a land use. That was kind of why that 10 years was chosen. The last slide that I have on the credit is just going back to the TMDL, and it's very large and complex, and accounting is very important, and so there has to be some verification measures in place to make sure that the BMPs that are being accounted for are actually there and doing what they're supposed to do. And so part of that verification is, well, it ties into this 10 years again. So the credit is an annual credit that you get every year, but they expire after 10 years with the assumption that after that time, the trees will be large enough to be captured by that imagery. And the Bay program plan is to update that imagery every 3 to 5 years. And so they'll eventually, whatever trees you plant for credits will eventually get captured as a land use. The other thing is that the modeling accounted for mortality, so it's kind of conservative in the sense that it assumes that some of the trees are probably not going to live, and so, excuse me, so it's conservative in that sense, although the recommendation is still to monitor the tree planting projects and replace any that die, as well as to use best practices in terms of designing the site, selecting the trees, planting the trees, and maintaining them. But the link that describes the credit is provided below. And my last slide is just to reiterate that the center has just recently, last week, we released the products from this overall project, which is the National Crediting Framework for Urban Trees. There's 2 separate credits. There's the Pollution Load Reduction Credit, which is for TMDL purposes, and then the Stormwater Performance-Based Credit, which is volume-based for on-site stormwater management. And then there's all the documentation that goes with it, which includes the literature synthesis, the water balance model, design specifications for urban tree planting, and then some additional documentation for the credits. The other links here are other resources that are helpful for trees and stormwater and crediting. There's a new site called treesandstormwater.org, which is basically a repository for all things related to trees and stormwater. And this was developed by the Forest Service and some other partners. There's another link here, which is from Stone Environmental in Vermont, which is a summary of tree crediting systems at the site scale. And then the last link here is the Urban Tree Canopy BMP Expert Panel report. So that is my last slide, and sorry we're taking this right up to 2 o'clock, but I think we have some time for questions if people are still on.